Okay, I'm going to deal with Chapter 4 on formation and Chapter 5 on force in Sun Tzu's The Art of War at the same time, because both of these chapters are really inscrutable. There's a lot here. It's very easy to interpret, but also very easy to misinterpret what Sun Tzu is saying. Right out of the bat, Sun Tzu says, in ancient times, this is at the beginning of chapter 4, in ancient times, those skilled in warfare made themselves invincible and then waited for the enemy to become vulnerable. Being invincible depends on oneself, but the enemy's vulnerability depends on himself. Okay, this is a very frequent theme in The Art of War, that you should do what it takes to make yourself as invincible as possible and then wait. Because victory is more likely when the enemy is at his most vulnerable. And this takes time. And of course, if you do anything that indicates that you are interested in attacking, the enemy will beef up his defenses. And so you can't do that. You wait and you think very creatively, and you find an opportunity at some point. But it may be a while before you can do that. So that's a fundamental theme in The Art of War. Waiting, being patient, making the enemy's vulnerability your first and really only major reason for action. Now, in Chapter 4, there's some other inscrutable statements, such as one takes on sufficiency defending, one takes on deficiency attacking. So, in general, I would have to say that this means that it is better to be in a defensive posture than an offensive posture, unless you have to be. And that with an offensive posture, you are more or less making yourself vulnerable to a certain extent. It is necessary sometimes to take on the offensive posture, but you need to realize that when you do this, you are taking risk, more risk, most of the time. He also says, perceiving a victory when it is perceived by all is not the highest excellence. Well, and he says also, winning battles such as the whole world cries excellent is not the highest excellence. Back to an old theme in Sun Tzu's Art of War, victory, which is true victory, is oftentimes not known except for the one who is victorious. That victory that is touted to the skies by the victor is actually a vulnerability. Because when one thinks that one's won, well, that didn't make much sense. If you think you've won and you are triumphant and you are exultant, this is when you are at your most vulnerable. Whereas if you are able to be humble, humble, then you will be able to more or less not acknowledge the success that you have. And by not acknowledging it publicly to the world, you remain less vulnerable. So again, we have this theme of the control, self-control, the control of the ego. Also in Chapter 4, he says, a victorious army first obtains conditions for victory and then seeks to do battle. A defeated army first seeks to do battle and then obtains conditions for victory. Yeah, that's kind of along the same lines, but a little bit of a nuance here. You do not want to more or less launch into battle to engage yourself before you have basically understood the situation and come up with plan A, B, and C. A defeated army first seeks to do battle, meaning that it is the general is motivated by emotions. Okay, by emotions and not by reason. And Sun Tzu always asks, listen not to emotions, in particular prideful emotions, but listen to reason instead. Okay, and then in chapter 5 on force, I highlighted this, not too far down from the top. He says, like the sun and the moon, they set and rise again. Like the 4 seasons, they, the successful army, end and begin again. There are no more than 5 musical notes, yet the variations in the 5 notes cannot all be heard. There are no more than 5 basic colors, yet the variation in the 5 colors cannot all be seen. There are no more than 5 basic flavors, yet the variations in the 5 flavors cannot all be tasted. So here Sun Tzu is saying something very similar to what Machiavelli said much later, which is that a leader, be it a general or a political leader or whatever, he's speaking of a general primarily, must not think in terms of rigid categories, but must be creative. Must be very creative. Must be able to think about options that go beyond the average imagination. Must be able to entertain the ideas that come into his head, which may not be what anybody else thinks is reasonable. Must be able to, as we say, so in a pedestrian fashion, think outside the box. To be flexible in one's thinking, ultimately flexible. To be able to see the opportunities where they really are, creatively. This is difficult for people to do because they want to have a formula in their head. They want to have the 5 steps or the 5 options or whatever it may be. But those are given to you by other people at other times based upon experience from other eras. And all of that is important. It's important to know what has happened in the past and what people have done in the past and the rules that they've come up with, but it is also important to know that this situation is different from any other. And as they came up with rules and maxims and policies for the times that they were living in, so can you come up with your own. This is a leap of great boldness to do in an epoch such as ours, where we are so inundated by historical information that it's hard for us to think that we might have a unique and creative idea. And yet Sun Tzu, and I think rightly, says you need to think beyond the categories that you are given and be ultimately creative. Open your mind up to the solutions and do not be hindered by your ego. Do not be hindered by your sense of pride. What will achieve your goal? Do not be stopped because it doesn't feel right at the moment, because you're worried about what other people might think, or the fact that it's never been done before. A little bit further down in chapter 5, he says, therefore the force of those skilled in warfare is overwhelming, and their timing is precise, and their force is like a drawn crossbow, and their timing is like the release of the trigger. Well, you know, this reminds me of body memory. and how we know how to act. When you think about it, every single moment of our lives, we experience this. Your thought and your bodily action is so interconnected and so like completely instantaneous that you don't even notice it, right? And it's based upon the integration of your brain and your body, so that your body becomes an extension of your brain. And what Sun Tzu is saying is your people, as far as the general goes, your people and your assets are your body, and they are an extension of your brain. And you need to be able to act in a sort of instinctual fashion, or this is the ultimate excellence, is being able to act with your group, with your army, with your people in an instinctual fashion, much as individuals can act by simply thinking and moving at the same time. This takes an incredible amount of cohesion and morale, which we will talk about in later chapters, because Sun Tzu does discuss morale. You cannot have this type of complete integration in any human organization without an incredible morale. Morale, M-O-R-A-L-E. Just a few more other things in this chapter 5. Sun Tzu says, fear coming from courage is a matter of force. Weakness coming from strength is a matter of formation, and therefore those skilled in moving the enemy use formation that makes the enemy respond. They offer bait, that which the enemy must take, manipulating the enemy to move while they wait in ambush. Well, that sounds kind of nasty. And indeed, by Western standards, so-called Western standards of just warfare, this doesn't go well. This doesn't go down well. The idea of sort of faking the enemy out and then ambush, right? Manipulating the enemy. We should be able to just sort of confront them. Well, I just want to say, throw that stuff out the window, because the Western ideal and the Western reality are two very different things. And by the way, to the extent that the American and Western military forces have emphasized simply the use of force over strategy and what is here called manipulation, they have failed. In Vietnam and in the current situation in the Middle East, the idea that the overwhelming use of force will win in battle and that you don't have to employ manipulation in its variety of uses, obviously, I'm going to say just obviously, does not work. The fact that the United States and the Western world generally has an overwhelming amount of force does not mean that that side is going to win. There is much more that is being employed in such conflicts: ideology, morale, energy, strategy, and not just how many troops you have and how many missiles you have. So this is kind of a no-brainer at this point, and yet it is not obvious to everybody. So Sun Tzu acts as a corrective by saying, you know what? The subtle use of manipulation, the psychological dimension, is extremely important. And in fact, more important, far more important than how many bombs you have. I'm speaking of in today's parlance, but how many bombs you have, how many troops you have, how big is your gross national product. Vietnam beat the United States of America. A very small country with very limited resources, North Vietnam, beat the United States of America and caused us to withdraw. So you would think that the lesson would be loud and clear, but it's not, and we're still trying it. The United States is still trying to use overwhelming force against enemies that are very, very, very ideologically motivated, and motivated by a sense of self-protection. So Sun Tzu's point is loud and clear here. It is a point that urges objectivity against ego and egoistic judgments of oneself. All right, on to chapter 6 next time.